on any item on our agenda today. If you are interested in speaking to the board, you can indicate that interest by using the raise hand function on your Zoom screen. If you are joining us telephonically only, indicate your interest in speaking by using *9. We'll take a pause in the proceedings to see if anybody wants to speak to the board. Not seeing anyone. Okay, let's move to item 10 on the agenda, the approval of the open session minutes from our September 23rd and 24th meeting, 2021. Are there any corrections, questions on the minutes? Mr. Tony.
I just wanted to commend the board secretary, Louisa, for very thorough minutes, especially listing every member of the public and summarizing their input. I think is going to be very valuable for the board as we move forward in trying to make decisions. So I did want to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Mr. Tony. Anyone else?
I just want to thank you, Mr. Tony, for your acknowledgement, because Louisa has been working really hard as she's transitioned into this role. And I know that felt good for her to also receive a note from you. So thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Tony.
Thank you, Louisa. Seeing nothing further, I'll accept a motion on the minutes.
Sorry, Jose, so moved.
Shelby,
Trustee
second.
Roll call, please.
Broughton,
Yes.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
De La Cruz, Dellen, Duran, I'm sorry, only if it breaks tie. Ganong,
Yes.
Petula, Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony,
Aye.
Seleg.
Yes.
The motion carries.
Thank you, Ms. Arapetian. Thank you, members of the board. We will move on to the chair's report. First on the agenda today is something that I'm a little bittersweet about. And as I looked across the room when I saw Judge Purcell walked in, I was hoping that I could, she would see the smile exuding from my eyes because of the mask, but it is far away. Judge Purcell, it is indeed an honor to have you here with us in person. And this is, as I mentioned, a bittersweet honor. For those of you who don't know Judge Purcell, she was up until last Friday, the presiding judge of the State Bar Court. And I have had the opportunity to work with her in various capacities as I was the vice chair of the RAD committee and then the vice chair of the board, and most recently as chair of this body. And throughout that time, I have been truly honored and pleased with watching her do her job and do it so well. Governor Newsom has taken notice of Judge Purcell and has stolen her from the state bar. And it is an important position that she's going to. She's been appointed to the Board of Parole Hearings for the state of California. And as she makes her way into that position, we didn't want to let the opportunity pass to acknowledge the many, many years of fine work that Judge Purcell has done, not only here at the state bar, but in her illustrious career as a public servant. And so we're going to spend a few minutes to share some accolades to Judge Purcell with all of our thanks. And I think I can confidently speak on behalf of all of my colleagues here on this board and on behalf of colleagues from boards past who have benefited from the fine work that you have done at the State Bar Court in serving serving the people and the lawyers of California. Judge Purcell was appointed to the State Bar Court in 2008 by the California Supreme Court as a review judge and was elevated to the position of presiding judge in 2014. So we're just about 8 years worth of service in that capacity in which I first got to meet Judge Purcell. She, in that role, oversees the administrative functions of the California State Bar Court. The California State Bar Court is the only tribunal of its kind in the nation charged with adjudicating attorney disciplinary cases. And it is a job that for those of us who don't practice in attorney discipline, probably don't have the opportunity to know about. I can tell you that in my practice as a public agency lawyer, my knowledge and familiarity with the State Bar Court was very minimal. And it was a great pleasure for me to learn about and to watch the workings of the court when I joined the State Bar Board of Trustees in 2018. And as I mentioned, that gave me the opportunity to take a very almost front and center seat, at least on the administrative side, watching Judge Purcell in action and seeing how she interacts with the other judges on the court, how she interacts with the staff of the court, how she interacts with attorneys who appear before that court, not in formal proceedings, but in other committees and proceedings. And it is always with a great degree of respect and honesty and transparency and really leadership. Judge Purcell is what I have seen in action when I have been on a Zoom with you over the past year and a half, but even and especially in person when we first met a couple of years ago. So I want to offer my personal thanks, the thanks of the board, and if Mr. McLeod would assist me, there is somebody who offers their own thanks and recognition, and so I'm going to present this to you. And I can't believe I'm saying this because this is kind of one of the cool things about being the State Bar Board Chair. This is on behalf of the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, Tani Cantil-Sakaoye. It is a recognition presented to Catherine D. Purcell for her distinguished service to the legal profession in California as presiding judge of the State Bar Court. It includes the stamped seal of the Supreme Court and a hand signature by the Chief Justice. I'm sure that the Chief Justice and you have spoken many times about the work that you've done. It's my honor to be the vehicle for this presentation to you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I've asked Judge Purcell to share a few parting words of wisdom with us, and she's graciously agreed to do that. So the floor is yours, Judge Purcell.
Okay, thank you. Great. Well, I'd like to first of all, thank you very much for your kind words, Ruben, and I very much appreciate them. And also, of course, I would like to thank the Chief Justice for this tremendous honor. But the honor really started when I was appointed in 2008 by Chief Justice Ron George and then reappointed by the Chief Justice currently. And it has been such an honor and a privilege to serve as the presiding judge and as a review judge, as any judge in the State Bar Court. It's also really been an honor and a privilege to get to know the board members here that I've met and been with many of you in training and at various meetings and presentations. And that's been a real highlight as well. And then finally, it's been wonderful to be in this specialty court and interacting with the individuals that interact in our court. But I have to say that it's been the most amazing experience to work in the State Bar Court, because the State Bar Court, the judges, the staff have the most amazing group of dedicated, talented, and truly caring individuals. And they make a team that is second to none. And so we do important work in the State Bar Court. I'm privileged to be able to continue to do important public service work in my role as commissioner for the Board of Parole. And I just have had such a fortunate professional life. And I want to thank all of you individually, as people I've come to know, and as a group, and everyone here at the State Bar Court for everything that they have done for me. And I hope that I have given back just a fraction of what everyone that I've met in this process has given to me. So thank you again. And I wish you all continued success and continued happiness in your lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge. We also wish you well in a new chapter in your career of service. Is there anyone on the board who would like to add anything? I know some of us have worked with Judge Purcell in various capacities. I'm looking at Vice Chair Stallings here. He was the chair of RAD for a couple of years, and I know worked very closely with Judge Purcell.
So just want to extend, just on behalf of past RAD leadership, chairs, vice chairs, everybody who's ever served on RAD knows that you are a vociferous advocate for your employees, for what you believe is right. Your center of morality is incredibly strong, and it's something that has always driven your decisions. And from a position of being on the board, I appreciate that, and I've always appreciated that about you. The other thing I really appreciate is having someone who understands the Central Valley and who started your career in Bakersfield as a Superior Court judge there in Kern County. It's always great to have that commonality, and especially when talking about geographic diversity, to have someone who understands issues in the way that you do, because you've been on the front lines. I think it really bears out in the way that you've approached cases as a judge. And so thank you. Best of luck in your next endeavor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brandon. Okay. Sean Zalig.
I'll just say it's been a pleasure to work with you on RAD leadership for 2 years and then board leadership for 2 years. And one of the things that has always leapt out at me about you is how much you cared not only about your people, as Brandon said, but also the integrity of the court and the process. And I really appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, Godspeed to you, Judge.
Yes, thanks so much.
Okay, we'll move on to item 30-2. This is appreciation for Interim Chief Trial Counsel Melanie Lawrence. Melanie, good to see you back there. We're going to spend a little bit of time thanking you for the incredible work that you've done here at the State Bar in that very unique position of being the Interim Chief Trial Counsel since 2018. Again, Brandon, in his role as the former RAD chair, worked with you very closely, and so we arm wrestled, and he won. He gets to make this introduction, and then we'll close it up in a little bit.
Melanie, would you care to come forward? Yeah. And if you know Melanie, never has sought the limelight, and that is, I think, something that really speaks to her as a person. But Melanie, the board's sins are sincere and heartfelt thanks to you being the interim chief trial counsel, and want to recognize your work as interim chief for the last 3.5 years. So as Sean mentioned, being able to serve with you as RAD chair and RAD leadership, really working alongside you, I've been able to see firsthand the dedication that you and your staff demonstrate on a daily basis in ensuring that members of the public are protected. And that in times of introspection, that no stone is left unturned in a search for a better way of doing things. And I've seen that firsthand. During this time, we've seen you take on this monumental task with decisive leadership, thoughtful and appropriate recommendations, and really common sense application. These attributes speak to your working in the trenches of the discipline system since 2005 and serving with excellence in every position you've ever been entrusted with. So times of pressure and upheaval reveal diamonds, and that is exactly what was revealed when you chose to volunteer to step into the role as Chief Trial Counsel in 2018. Your volunteering, and there's the difference between being voluntold and volunteered. You volunteering really speaks to your care and deep concern for this agency and for the work of the State Bar employees, and the importance that you place on the work of each employee in the Office of Chief Trial Counsel to protect the public, and to do so in a way that captures the respect and admiration of your colleagues. And we've seen that through speaking with people who you've supervised, who you've worked alongside with. And it's been incredible to see your evolution as a leader, someone who hasn't sought the spotlight, but yet inspires and leads by example. So to close it out, thank you for your personal sacrifices that you have made over the past 3.5 years And thank you for your support of the continued work of the State Bar and OCTC, and your support for the newly appointed Chief Trial Counsel, George Cardona. Once again, your support during this transition time speaks to your excellent character, and we as a board are delighted to recognize you for your selfless giving of your time, experience, and talent. So I'm going to hand it back over to Ruben.
Thank you, Brandon. Very, very well said. If I could trouble staff to put the resolution up, that is the vehicle for actually making this recognition. But before we open up the floor, I would like to say that speaking personally, when I first came on this board and was asking questions and sometimes in ways that belied some things I didn't know, you were very, very kind and very helpful in taking me aside, addressing my question beyond what had been offered in the public, just to ensure that I had my concerns addressed and satisfied. And I really appreciated your proactivity in that regard. You did it in a way that was kind, informative, and really told me very quickly that you took the job that you were doing extremely seriously, that you take public protection extremely seriously, and that you work very hard at it. And so I think we've all benefited from your knowledge and your experience, as has the state. So thank you very much. Colleagues, is there anything that you would like to add? Anybody? Mr. Saleg.
Well, I'm not going to repeat all the wonderful things that have already been said and that are undoubtedly true. But I just want to say it's been a pleasure to work with you, Melanie. I'm very grateful to you for having taken on this responsibility, been a fine leader and steward of OCTC during a difficult time. And the thing that always stands out for me about you, two things really, is that you're all about duty and running the office the way it should be run to protect the public, and not about ego. And I think that just says a lot about you and your values. And also, you just have a wonderful, calm demeanor. So we've been dealing with some difficult issues recently, and you just have a really calm manner that inspires a lot of confidence. So thank you. It's been good to know you.
Second that. Anybody else? Okay, so let me make clear to everybody, Melanie's not going anywhere. So we don't have a parting certificate to give you, but we will very soon, I hope, vote on this resolution. It will be made a part of the official records of the bar. It comes obviously with all of our deep gratitude and thanks, and really excitement in continuing to work with you in the office under George's leadership. So I'm going to read it if you folks don't mind. Typically, I don't necessarily read a resolution, but I would like to hear this and say it out loud. Resolve that the Board of Trustees adopt the following resolution of appreciation to Melanie Lawrence. Whereas Melanie Lawrence served the State Bar of California with devotion and distinction and exercised impeccable leadership. Further resolved that the Board of Trustees hereby expresses to Melanie Lawrence its sincere appreciation for her admirable accomplishments and efforts expended on behalf of the State Bar. Is there a mover of that motion?
This is Brandon. So moved.
Mr. Stallings. Mr. Saleg seconds. Roll call, please.
Broughton,
Yes.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
Dela Cruz, Delan, Ganong,
Yes.
Petula, Saleg,
Yes.
Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony.
Aye.
The motion carries.
That's unanimous vote. Thank you. If I could vote, I would.
Thank you. Much appreciated.
Okay, we'll move on to the consent calendar. Before we put it on the table, I would like. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Thank you.
And George, if you could ask Melanie to come back, because I am going to embarrass her a little bit too. I wanted to wait.
She almost got away.
You don't need to sit up here for this. This is my ED report. It's going to be very brief. You don't have to stand either. You can sit where you want to sit. I wanted to just give the board kind of an update on some things that I don't usually get to talk about with you. And that is what I would call some of our culture work. and thinking about what kind of organization we want to be. So one of the things I want to let the board know is we're working really hard to figure out what return to the office looks like at the state bar. In thinking about that, we want to understand how we are going to attract and retain talent in this new world where people don't want to have to come into the office every day. They want to have greater flexibility and autonomy in how they do their work. I know that we need to transition to being a knowledge and data-driven organization. We have to be an employer that can attract and retain top talent. And I want to let the board know that our long-term hybrid remote policy will reflect these values, and we will be announcing that soon in the coming weeks. I also want to give the board a brief update on some of our DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion work here at the bar, and to give you a sense that it has some real depth. We recently had a conversation that I facilitated, a fireside chat with no fire, and it was called Building Better Allies. And what I want to share with you is that this conversation made me quite uncomfortable. The conversation was centered around the concept of the marginalized and the allies. And as a woman of color, I certainly see myself and understand myself to be part of the marginalized group and certainly in different venues and times in my life. But I also see myself in a position of power and as someone who is capable of and should be an ally. And these are the kinds of complex issues that we discussed. And I raise that with you to share that I am proud of the level of depth at which we are trying to tackle these very serious issues. And I wanted the board to be aware of that. Lastly, and why I asked Melanie to come back, as an organization and as a leader, I want us to embrace a growth mindset. And when I think about you, Melanie, and your time in the interim role, I think about your willingness to step out of your comfort zone, particularly to be more vulnerable with your staff. And in doing so, you created the kind of legitimacy and trust that a true leader needs. And so I want to recognize you for that. I know it was hard. You are so professional and so sometimes serious, and you let go of a lot of that and built real relationship. And I am honored to have seen that and really excited to learn from you. And Judge Purcell, who's left, she's also inspirational to me. She's had an incredible career. We didn't talk about that, but she was a nurse. She was a mental health practitioner. She's lived all over the world. She's taken many different risks with her career. And now, at a time when many of us would retire safely from a fairly cushy job at the state bar, she's choosing to take a radical career change and go to the parole board. This is inspirational. This is the kind of growth mindset that we need. And so we learn from Melanie, we learn from Judge Purcell. I do, and I hope that all of my staff does as well. So those are my remarks, and thank you, Melanie, for coming back.
Thank you, Leah. That was very well put. And we'll make sure that Judge Purcell gets a copy of the recording for this meeting.
I've also shared that with her.
I'm sure.
Yes.
Okay, now we will move on to the consent calendar. I will note for the board that item 54-112, which I will read, just the title of, for the record, the annual recommendation for appointment of members, the California Board of Legal Specialization, has been pulled from today's agenda. It's not up for consideration or action. And if I'm not mistaken, we will pull at least one other item for a separate vote. Is it 50.8, 50-8? Okay. Does any other member of the board wish to pull anything from the consent calendar? Mr. Tony?
I would like to pull 50-6 from the consent calendar. Thank you.
Okay, for those following along at home, 50-6 is proposed amendments to State Bar Rule 7.61, which will get introduced first thing after voting on the consent calendar. Anybody else? Great. With that, can I have a motion, please, for the consent calendar, except for 50-6, 50-8, and 54-112?
This is Stallings, so moved.
It's a motion by Stallings,
Second by Jose.
second by Cisneros. May I have the roll.
Broughton,
Yes.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
Dela Cruz, Glenn, Ganong,
Yes.
Petula, Stalag,
Yes.
Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony,
Aye.
the motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Item 50-6 is proposed amendments to State Bar Rule 7.61 regarding voting procedures of the Commission on Judicial Nominees Evaluation. Jenny, and return from public comment and request for approval. Mr. Tony, would you like a staff report or do you want to shoot straight into a question?
Staff report would be good to set the context. Thank you.
I will hand that over to Mr. McLeod, I believe, who's looking for a mic.
So returning to the September meeting where this was presented, the recommendation regarding amendments to Rule 7.61 relate to a contradiction that's built into the rules that we discovered. And that contradiction has simply to do with the fact that the Jenny Commission is required to assign a rating. One of 4 ratings of any of the candidates that come before the Jenny Commission. The rating can either be not qualified or then 3 categories of qualified. You can be qualified, well qualified, or exceptionally well qualified. The Jenny rules also, however, include a specific provision that says in the vote totals, you must include abstentions as part of the vote total. And so then when you get to determining whether a candidate is qualified or not qualified, because a finding of at least half of the commissioners is needed in order to be clear the qualified threshold and be one of those 3 qualified categories. By counting abstentions, you can actually find yourself in a position where a candidate is neither qualified nor not qualified. And so there's no way to assign a rating to the candidate. What I recall of the conversation, I won't try to characterize the conversation at the September meeting. And simply say that we're attempting to provide a simple technical fix so that the Jenny commissioners do no longer have this sort of gray area into which a rating can fall where they can't actually assign a rating according to the rules as written. Is there any more that you'd like to hear about the proposal?
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Trustees, Tony, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes. I take issue with this proposed change as I did at the last meeting, because I think, when you're talking about making recommendations for the appointment of judges, judges have a tremendous amount of power. They wield a tremendous amount of powers over people's lives. And I think it's important to make sure that the judges, that when Jenny is making recommendations, that there's clarity that the judge is one of the qualified categories. And I do not support, and what that means is I believe that you need a majority of the members of the Jenny Commission to vote affirmatively in one of the 3 categories of qualified. If a candidate fails to reach a majority, and I do mean majority of the committee, not just president voting, okay, which is what the change implies, that you don't count the abstentions, that you want candidates that are, to get a qualified rating, to get it from the majority of members. And you don't want a situation where 50% say they're qualified and 50% say they're not qualified. That's a huge red flag, particularly if you have some of the people also abstaining. You could then have somebody get a qualified rating with a minority vote of the Jenny Commission. I don't think that makes sense. And so I believe that this proposal actually weakens accountability and weakens the weight of the Jenny's Commission recommendation. So I'm voting no on this one.
Trustee Stallings.
Mr. Chair, thank you. So I'm in support of this recommendation for a couple of different reasons. And to Mr. Tony's point about putting the stamp of approval on a candidate, that Jenny stamp is definitely something that's very weighty and a lot goes into it. And in my experience as an appointment liaison in speaking with individuals who are applying to Jenny just as regular members or through their leadership ladder, those individuals are generally very connected in their legal communities, know a lot of people, have done incredible things in their own career, and take this job equally as seriously. And in order to ensure that Jenny's stamp of approval carries with it that weight, they also take the issue of recusal very seriously. And if there's any sort of question about their voting on a particular candidate, that it could be biased by their own personal feelings, something that the commissioners, I think, put a lot of time and effort in evaluating. And so I think that this proposal actually ensures that the Jenny stamp of approval carries with it the same, if not more weight, because it recognizes those Jenny officers as taking their job so seriously that they're going to completely abstain. And even, when they take their job seriously, I don't think it should be to the detriment of the individual going through the Jenny process. So I think this strikes a good balance in that. And in my view, doesn't diminish from Jenny's work, but only, I think, elevates it.
Thank you, Trustee Stallings. Anyone else?
One quick, there's a difference, and I respect that sometimes commissioners must recuse themselves from a vote because of a conflict of interest. Okay, that applies to the Board of Trustees as well. A recusal is different from an abstention. This proposal very specifically uses the term abstention, not recusal. I could understand a recusal not being counted against the candidate. That I understand. I believe that's different from an abstention.
Mr. McLeod, please.
Yeah, that's correct. Jenny commissioners are exceptionally clear about recusals. We're very strict about making sure commissioners leave the room when there's a recusal, when there's any reason. The abstentions issue is different. In the practical application of this, though, the reality is we don't quite know the reason for which people were abstaining. Our impression is that it was probably more of a social thing where people don't want to, these conversations can get quite heated, and people don't want to pick a side. And so what we were seeing is these 4 or 5 people abstaining for reasons that were unclear. When we made the clarification to the commissioners about the way in which these abstentions can affect the vote, we saw the abstentions go way down. And so the practical effect simply of informing the commissioners that your abstentions would be counted toward the total has declined, it's diminished the number of abstentions that we're seeing, and it's made it less likely that we're going to find ourselves in this type of position. But to that same point, I just want to note that I think that it's extremely unlikely that you would get a situation where you have this big majority of people abstaining. It just doesn't. I think it was more of a sort of social thing where people didn't want to be seen as taking a side. And now that they understand the true impact of it, they recognize that they need to sort of stake their ground.
Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, may I have a motion? Moved by Broughton. Is there a second? I will second the item to bring it to a vote.
Broughton,
Yes.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
De La Cruz, Delenn, Ganong,
Abstain.
Bertula, Saleg, Shelby,
Abstain.
Sol,
I'm going to abstain as well.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony,
nay,
the motion does not carry.
Will you give us the vote tally for the record, please?
We have 3 yeses, 1 no, and 4 abstain.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to item 50-8. I believe this item was pulled by Mr. Broughton. Mr. Broughton, would you care to hear a staff report or would you like to ask a question?
No, I don't. I need to abstain on this item. So
Okay.
That's the reason that I asked it be pulled.
Okay. I will note that this item was discussed at the executive committee and it passed through the executive committee. Are there any questions on item 50.8? May I have a motion, please?
I'll move the motion.
Motion by Cisneros, second by Seleg. Roll call, please.
Broughton,
Abstain.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
Dela Cruz, Delenn, Ganong,
Yes.
Petula, Saleg, Shelby,
Abstain.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony,
aye,
I believe we need one more vote to, for it to pass.
Madam Counsel, may I vote? It's not a tie. So we don't have a quorum of the members present voting in the affirmative.
I think you only vote in a tie.
Mhm.
That was my understanding as well. Okay, so the item fails without sufficient votes to pass. I'm going to exercise a little bit of the chair's prerogative and point out that in the absence of an affirmative vote, the item fails. If there were anybody willing to reconsider their abstention to get the item through, it would require a motion to reconsider by the prevailing side, although there is no prevailing side since we don't have a, well, the prevailing side would be failure, correct? So if anybody is willing to put a motion to reconsider on the table, that's an option. If not, we will move on. Okey doke. And away we go. We're going to move on to the 700 series of our agenda. Item 701 is a discussion regarding the final report and recommendations from the Committee on Special Discipline Case Audit for the development of a California Trust Account Program.
Ruben,
Yes, sir.
excuse me, did we do 54-112? We pulled that.
That's been
wrong.
pulled. It's not up. It's been pulled from the agenda. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's been off, it's taken off the agenda. Sorry about that. And this is a request for extension on the deadline for public comment issuance. Mr. Cisneros, please.
Thank you very much, Chair Duran. Good afternoon, everyone. With regards to this item at this board's meeting in July of this year, the board established the Committee on Special Discipline Case Audit and asked me to chair it. Thank you, former Chair Saleg. Thank you for your support, current Chair Duran. This committee was established to further analyze the audit report on closed discipline cases against Thomas Girardi and to develop a proposed corrective action. The committee was specifically directed to work with staff to conduct a study and develop recommendations for increasing the state bar's ability to effectively and proactively regulate client trust accounts and attorney-client trust account management. Consistent with the urgency and importance of its assignment, the committee has met nearly every 2 weeks since its formation. The committee's work was greatly informed by an understanding of what other states and countries are doing in this area and in financial auditing generally. What we learned is that rather than leading in this area of regulation, California has allowed itself to fall behind. The current system of client trust account regulation relies significantly on complaints brought by clients against their attorneys. However, because clients can easily be deliberately kept uninformed about their rights with respect to funds to which they are entitled, as well as the timing of that entitlement, a complaint-driven approach to addressing violations of the rules is wholly inadequate. The recommendations developed by the committee aim to strengthen the state bar's oversight and regulation of client trust accounts by incorporating program elements whose effectiveness have been demonstrated in other jurisdictions and in other domains. The linchpin of the recommendations, the proposed Client Trust Account Protection Program, represents a comprehensive approach that will improve trust accounting practices in general, detect and correct negligence, and proactively target those attorneys who engage in intentional misconduct regarding entrusted funds. As noted in the report, we unfortunately cannot vote today to implement the program or any of the other outlined recommendations. The program design needs to be fully developed, and most importantly, statutory and rule authority, as well as funding, need to be in place to effectuate most of the recommendations. We're able today, however, to advance serious and much needed reforms that, once implemented, will fundamentally improve the protection of clients. The program proposed by the committee is designed to correct this failure. And with that, we'll turn it over to Leah to begin the presentation of our findings.
Okay, thank you, Jose. So just a reminder for the board of the original charge of the committee that was established. It includes these 7 items. I'm not going to read them off to you, but you can see there many of them center around trust account auditing and looking at other measures of protection for client funds. At the committee's first meeting, it added elements to its charge, and those are listed here. So increasing attorney education on the responsibilities around trust accounting, identifying patterns of complaints requiring increased scrutiny by the state bar, training for OCTC and special deputy trial counsel, rules or statutory amendments addressing the issue of prompt disbursement of client funds, threats to withdraw representation, and failure to communicate, and the question of whether or not mandatory malpractice insurance may be an appropriate protective measure. Before we get started with our recommendations, I wanted to give the board, or not actually me, I'm hoping Steve Moad is available, to give the board just a brief overview, sort of the basics of trust accounting and how these issues show up at the state bar. So Steve, if you are there.
I am here. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so just briefly, a couple of concepts associated with client trust accounts. The first is that each client's money is their own. That means that the attorney cannot spend money from one client either to pay their own obligations or the obligations of another client. Another concept is it's a zero-sum game, and that is that they can only use that money to pay for that client's expenses. So if they have funds belonging to one client or multiple clients in there, they can't use it for the other purpose because it's essentially cutting into the balance. So that belongs to that individual client. There's no such thing as a negative balance. In client trust accounting, there's only 2 acceptable balances. That is a positive balance, meaning you're holding money for a client, or a zero balance when all the client's money has been paid out. The third possible balance is that you have less than zero. That's a negative balance, and that is at best a sign of negligence or at worst theft. The fourth concept is a check can't be cashed if it's still in the mail, and that is, like we all know, you can't spend money before you have it. And so just because somebody has sent a check to you does not mean that you can pay out against that check. You actually have to wait for that check to clear. The fifth concept is that there are really 2 types of balances. There's a running balance that of the money that a lawyer holds for each client, and there's also the running balance of the account in total. And the lawyer has to be aware of both of those balances before releasing funds. So they have to make sure that there's enough money in the account, and they have to make sure that there's enough of a balance for that individual client. The key concept number 6 is the final balance has to be 0. That means that they don't get to keep money that's left over. The money, all the money that comes in must go out eventually. And finally, they have to maintain an audit trail, and there are requirements for what is maintained, what that means to maintain an audit trail. It generally includes the deposit slip, bank statements, and ledgers and things like that. So the rules of professional conduct are meant to support these concepts. Rule 1.15 paren A says that all funds, including fees that have yet to be earned, must be deposited into a bank account that's clearly labeled as a client trust account. You have to hold that money in trust. 1.15C, with limited exceptions, prohibits lawyers from depositing their own money into that account and requires that they withdraw at the earliest possible time any money in which the lawyer has an uncontested interest. So if they have earned a fee, they have to then withdraw that money. 1.15D1 says that when lawyers receive money or other property on behalf of a client, they have to promptly notify the client of that fact. And D7 requires lawyers to distribute promptly any funds owed to the client. There are other rules regarding the records that are created by the bank to show what goes into and out of client trust accounts as well. So primary sources of complaints involving allegations of client trust accounts are clients and banks. Bank complaints, if you will, show up in the form of reportable action bank matters. Those are non-sufficient fund activity reports that are submitted to us by banks pursuant to Business and Professions Code section 6091.1. And as you can see, for the period of March 2019 through December 2020, we had 3,025 1.15 violations. 32% of those filed regarding fees, funds, including client trust accounts and IOLTA. And it is important to make a distinction between client trust accounts and IOLTA accounts. IOLTA accounts are interest on lawyer trust accounts, and they are for generally for combinations of client funds. There are other client trust accounts that can be dedicated for an individual client. That is not an IOLTA account. That is where the interest goes to the client. And so we may need to look at changing the rules around registration of those types of accounts, so the State Bar is aware of those types of individual client trust accounts as well.
Thanks, Steve. Is that it?
Yes.
Great. And you've teed up the recommendations nicely. And just as a bit more context for the board, we currently only require attorneys to give us information about IOLTA accounts. And we know there are about 50,000 IOLTA accounts in the state. Those are the pooled funds. We have no idea how many client trust accounts there are. So I'm going to walk through a bit of the background information that the committee gathered and reviewed in developing its recommendations, and then turn it over to Jose to actually go over the recommendations with the board. But the committee first addressed these elements of its charge, and these that you can see here, the general theme again is auditing and having better oversight and understanding of what is going on with client trust accounts, specifically client trust accounts, not IOLTA accounts. Again, we have no visibility on client trust accounts. So one of the things that the committee learned, and this was a surprise to me as well, that in 2014, RAD itself had initiated exploration of an audit program, and in fact had hired a consultant to develop such a program. And you can see these bullet points here outline the parameters of that program, which would have included questionnaires and desk reviews or audits and compliance reports. It is unclear why that initiative did not go forward. We at the staff level did reach out to the consultant and learned that a final report was never issued. I do believe that the initiative was dropped as a result of a change in RAD leadership. And in recent years, I think the board has, to great success, address some of the challenges that the changes in leadership have with respect to the consistency and continuity of our efforts. I don't think this would happen again, but certainly it appears to have happened back then. We also reviewed audit programs in other states and other countries, and I'm certainly not going to go through all of this data with you, but I think the point, and again, this was somewhat surprising, is that many other states actually have programs in place. They certainly are not touching the entirety of the attorney population. There's varying levels of information we were able to get about these states, but what you can see is that California certainly won't be the first. And as Jose mentioned in his remarks, it does appear that we are somewhat behind in implementing stronger oversight and protection of client trust accounts. So I've gone through the US states, then we looked at Victoria, Australia, which is auditing about 10% of its lawyers. And we were heavily influenced by programs in Canada, particularly the Law Society of Alberta. Canada has a very robust program in place. We also looked outside of just auditing trust accounts. We wanted to learn how are similar practices being implemented in other venues or other settings. So we have a couple of examples here. Something that was interesting for us to learn is that the Cemetery and Funeral Bureau in the state does audit those accounts that folks that are created when you make a deposit for a burial site. The money sits in trust with the funeral home. Those accounts are audited. We similarly learned that all non-real estate escrow accounts are audited. And we learned about some interesting escrow accounts that exist in this state for things like movie productions. When there's a film being produced, money needs to go into escrow. There's a whole host of reasons that we have non-real estate escrow accounts. Those are all audited by the state. So again, we started to feel we may not be on the forefront, we may be a bit behind. And we also really benefited from talking to some folks on Jose's team with the City and County of San Francisco. And just like to turn it over to you, Jose, to tell us a little bit about what your people do.
Sure, thanks, Leah. At the City and County of San Francisco, both the Tax Collector's Office and the Controller's Office have standing teams that perform review and audits of everything from taxpayer businesses to nonprofits and other organizations that the city and county grants funds to or partners with. For example, in the tax collector's office of the nearly 100,000 businesses in San Francisco, in the process of collecting over 180 different types of taxes and fees, the tax collector's office has a staff of 15 people that each year audits several hundred businesses, which still amounts to less than 1% of the businesses. And the controller's office has a 30-person audit staff that's performing audits on 50 plus San Francisco, both internal departments and outside organizations. These audits look at risk assessment and incorporate best audit practices and standards, and are really done to find anomalies and bad behavior. One of the things I will say, particularly on the tax collector side, is that, as you'll see in our recommendation, one of the key pieces to the work we do at the city and county is by having all taxpayers for many of our taxes and fees file annual just reports of what they're doing, just gathering standard information from all the businesses in the city, at least give a lead in to what Leah, you mentioned earlier, which is quite a different comparison to not even knowing how many client trust accounts exist in the state of California. It's simply that kind of simple reporting far in advance of any kind of a real audit that can be very revealing and help develop a clearer understanding of how the business is being handled. Thank you.
All right, well, great segue, Jose, for you to take us into, well, let me go over key takeaways and then you'll take us into our recommendations. So some of our key findings: many other state bars audit client trust accounts. Sounds basic, but we did learn that through this process. There are robust programs in place, particularly in other countries, which can serve as a model for the California effort. And in fact, we were lucky to hear from the program in Alberta, Canada. Similarly, there are parallel models in place in other parts of government that can be learned from. And the California State Bar is behind in not having such a program in place.
Okay, thanks, Leah. So looking first at the recommendations, establish a client trust account protection program. As I referenced just a minute ago, one of the first things that the program would include would just be some sort of an annual registration, an annual reporting of all client trust accounts created, managed, and in existence with any attorneys in California. That would include a fair amount of detailed account information and an annual certification by each attorney that they are in compliance with rules and statutes pertaining to the handling of client trust accounts, and an annual self-assessment. And these would be mandatory. Accompanied by compliance reviews completed on the client trust accounts with proper oversight and analysis tools. Many of these could be conducted by outside CPAs. Attorneys could secure those themselves, have their client trust accounts, particularly if they're sizable, be audited and have those results ready. And then also have risk review and follow-up written statements and of deficiencies and a requirement to correct deficiencies, perhaps leading all the way to an audit and perhaps leading to referral to formal discipline. But I think the third, the column on the right is one of the most important things. And we heard this from another number of other jurisdictions, which is that once you start looking very comprehensively at all attorneys handling client trust accounts, what we find far more often than anything else is that mistakes made with client trust accounts management are oftentimes just a lack of education. It's or a matter of an attorney being in a single attorney practice or a small firm and just not having the bandwidth or the tools to be able to manage their client trust accounts successfully. And so what is needed in those cases is simply the most comprehensive and effective education we can find, support, help for those types of attorneys. And I can't help but harken back to the situations where we get, notices of bank overdrafts, particularly from small one-person attorney practices or whatever. That just seems to me that, the overwhelming majority of those cases are cases of an attorney who needs help, support, and assistance to manage their obligations successfully. So I really feel that the education and the support for attorneys in terms of handling and managing successfully client trust accounts is one of the largest portions of this program. Next slide. Certainly, when talking about any program of this type, we have to be mindful that the extra work will come at an additional cost. What you see on the slide are just the beginning estimates of what this might take, again, based on the practices we saw in other jurisdictions. The slide shows that it could be as much as $3.35 million in annual additional cost for the work of everything we just talked about, the reporting, the review, the analyses, all the way up to including the audits and the education, with as much as $500,000 of one-time startup to get systems and trainings put in place. And as I said, based on what we see in a lot of other places, but giving us the ability to complete up to 500 reviews and audits annually. Statutory and, as Leah, you mentioned, statutory and rule authority would be needed to implement this type of a program, which would certainly require a phased implementation since statutory changes are going to take time. We need to finalize the program design, certainly begin to work on and secure the legislative authority, and then issue the implementing rules. Next slide. Also looking at the committee's charge, we wanted to look at a few other things that really fell into the area of work needed here. As I talked about the rule or statutory amendments, addressing prompt disbursement of client funds. There was a matter that the board has discussed at least a few times, which is right now, there's not a lot of clarity or complete clarity in the rules of how to handle client funds, including what is a prompt disbursement of client funds. And so maybe setting a more clear standard in terms of what prompt disbursement means, setting an actual number of dates, deadline. Also, a complete elimination of what appears to be in the statute today, which is a burden for the client to request disbursement in order to really secure the obligation for the client trust account funds to be dispersed. So we wanted to look very clearly at that. Next slide. We also want to have an obligation to communicate. The lawyer is required to keep the client reasonably informed. Again, we want to make sure that all clients are aware of all the funds in their account, the status of the funds, client trust account management, and its engagement can be complicated. Funds can show up, but they may not be cleared for disbursement. They still may have decisions or rulings that could affect the ultimate distribution of those funds. So again, these are all the things that the clients have the right to know and understand, and putting obligations on the attorneys to make sure their clients are aware of that is all part of this addressing a failure to communicate. Next slide. And then we also looked at the role of bonding and insurance, particularly in the case of bad actors or very, very egregious mishandling of client trust accounts. What we thought, what remedies might be possible to still safeguard and protect the clients and their funds. And so we looked at both the idea of bonds. Many other domains and jurisdictions have considered or currently use bonds to backfill funds that were either mishandled or actually stolen so that clients can be protected. The idea of also looking at various forms of insurance, including malpractice insurance, and how they're structured and what protections they might give to clients in terms of client trust account protection is also something we want to take a look at. Next.
I think are the recommendations.
Yeah, so this goes to the recommendations.
Yeah, this goes to the recommended board resolutions. Before we get to that, I don't know if other members of the committee, Sean or Ruben, that are here, Melanie, want to add anything?
Nothing for me. I think it's an excellent presentation.
You know, I was reflecting on the work of this committee, and you know, I think we should stay away from patting ourselves on the back, but I think we have to recognize how quickly this group moved in terms of addressing an issue. And for me, now that I think I'm almost a year into my service, it was eye-opening, just this whole understanding around client trust accounts and the massive issue that exists. And when you think about the mission of the State Bar, particularly to protect the public and the advancement of ethical and competent practice of law, I think we're moving in the right direction. And I can't wait for us to get to the end of this in terms of implementation. And I know the comment was made kind of repeatedly that we don't have anything in place, but I see it through a different lens. I think once we put something in place, it will be a model that others can utilize across the country. So I just want to commend the chair, I want to commend the staff, and I want to commend my colleagues, because I think I missed one meeting in the 2-week meetings that we've done. And I mean, we really have gotten in there and we get some really hard work done. And so it's been quite educational for a public member. So thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Shelby. Jose, I'll echo the thanks of the folks who have spoken. Also pointing out that we're not quite done, right? This is a partial way through the process. I do want to acknowledge and thank the work of Steve Scheffler, Richard Scheffler, excuse me, which I found to be very, very helpful and informative and just a good guy to work with. Trustees, any questions of Jose or Leah or any other members of the special committee? Go ahead, Brandon.
So I know that the client security fund pays out, many millions of dollars every year as a result of attorney malfeasance. Do we have an idea of the percentage of those funds that are paid out every year? How many of them go to attorney-client trust accounting issues?
We do, but I don't have it on the top of my head. One of the hardworking special committee members asked that question. Richard Schaffler, our great consultant on this, did work with Oriya and the client trust account team to get the data, but I don't have it. I'm sorry, Brandon.
Any other questions, Sean?
No, I'd like to move the item for adoption by the Board of Trustees.
Okay, if we could see the resolution up on the screen, please. Thank you. I'll let the trustees read it for yourselves just a bit, make sure that there are no required or recommended changes to any of what's been prepared. I have none.
I'd like to second it if I may.
Thank you, Mr. Tony. Any discussion on the resolution? May we have a roll call, please?
Broughton,
Yes.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
De La Cruz, Delenn, Benong,
Yes.
Petula, Saleg,
Yes.
Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony.
Aye.
The motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. We'll move to item 702, proposed amendments to the schedule of charges and deadlines related to accredited law school fees. This is a request for adoption. Ms. Ching and Ms. Leonard, or Ms. Leonard, who would be presenting for us? Great. We're waiting for staff to come online. I see Ms. Ching and I see Ms. Leonard. Welcome back, or welcome back to one of you.
Thank you.
Please.
Good afternoon. Hopefully everyone can hear us all right. We are here to present item 702. I'll be sharing my screen in a second, but I'll let Natalie take it away for the summary.
Sure, thank you. To the members of the Board of Trustees, as you know, you've been working over the past 2 years now on preparing the new scheme for the accredited law school rules that will be implemented in January, implementing the new purposes for accreditation. The very last step in that process is a technical amendment to the schedule of charges and deadlines. You may not look at that very often, but if you do, and I'll ask Audrey to bring up attachment A so we can take a look at it here. When the State Bar imposes a charge, it's listed on the schedule of charges and deadlines, and each charge is notated by the rule that relates to it. Because the rules are being changed completely as part of the overhaul taking effect in January, the rule numbers, not surprisingly, are changing. And so the purpose of this is to change those rule numbers. And in the middle of the format, you can see one additional fee that was added, but it uses the format that is already in place. So to provide context, the way that the accredited and actually also the unaccredited law school fees are built is that each law school pays a very modest annual fee between about $900 and $2,200 a year. And then beyond that, the only additional fees they pay are the hourly fees for the actual services that they request. A new service that they will be able to request starting in 2022 is to become a jointly accredited law school if they're also institutionally accredited, and that will be billed in the same way, a time and service. Because we were doing this, we also took the opportunity to change some of the wording to match the State Bar style. And you see that in red a little bit there. So it's not a change to the fees, more the style. We also specifically broke out the fee for waivers. Waivers were always charged in the same way, but during this pandemic time, we've been receiving more requests for waivers because the schools are operating in unprecedented times. So it's not a change, but just making it more clear in the schedule. I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Leonard. Trustees, any questions for Ms. Leonard or Ms. Chu? Okay, no questions. Great, thank you. Trustee Stallings.
So I just want to commend staff and the Board of Trustees for continuing work in this area. I think one of the things that we have talked about every single year is issues of access to justice and making sure that all Californians can have legal representation, especially those individuals in rural areas or frontier areas. And some of the reports we've received specifically cite to what's going on in Fresno. Fresno has a local law school, and they have some of the best representation rates of rural areas. And this idea of providing low cost, excellent legal education to people who may not come from means or may not have the ability to take out large student loans, I think really helps drive these access issues. So I want to commend staff for wrestling with the numbers. It's kind of sometimes a messy thing, especially in the Appendix I slice and dice days. But this is something that the board kept. We continue to accredit law schools, and I think it's an important piece in ensuring that if an individual wants to seek legal education, then they have the ability to do so despite their socioeconomic status. So really happy with this item, and I would move it.
Motion by Stallings. Do I have a second?
This is going on second.
Ganong seconded. Any debate? Additional comments? Seeing none, may I have the roll call, please?
Broughton,
Yes.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
De La Cruz, Delenn, Ganong,
Yes.
Petula, Saleg, Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony,
Aye.
motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. It's about 2:35. At this point, I'm going to ask for a 10-minute break. Get yourself refreshed, and we'll be back here at 2:45, please.
Thank you.
think we're gonna get before we start recording? Do you think we're gonna get through everything today?
You won't get too close. Okay, we are back recording and back in session a few minutes later than I anticipated. I apologize. Members of the board, I wanted to let you know that we took a break so that I could have a sidebar with General Counsel about the two votes that we took when we pulled items 50.6 and 50.8 from the consent calendar. Vanessa, would you update the board on where we are?
Yes, I think there's a real question whether those resolutions passed or not. They were determined not to have, they were determined to have failed. But I question that and want to spend some time deciding. And that has to do with the oddity of the state bar's adoption or non-adoption of Robert's Rules of Order. It generally is not required to fully follow Robert's Rules of Order. Under Robert's Rules of Order, those two may have actually passed, but we have various resolution and rules that may define terms differently that I need to collect and look at. And either tomorrow or shortly thereafter, I'll be able to opine on whether they actually passed or not.
Thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate you taking the time to look into the issue just so that we're clear one way or another. With that, we'll move on to item 703, which is proposed new and amended rules of procedure to conduct state bar court proceedings remotely, request for interim adoption and request to circulate for public comment. And Ms. Doherty, there you are. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. So as the chair indicated, we have two requests before you. The first is to adopt interim rules of procedure that will authorize the state bar court to continue to conduct remote events. The second is to issue that same set of rules for a 45-day public comment period for possible permanent adoption. I think it might be helpful to give a little bit of background regarding the state bar court's use of remote court events currently, and to explain why we are seeking interim adoption of these rules. So effective in the early stages of the pandemic, the Judicial Council adopted Emergency Rule 3 of the California Rules of Court. This rule has authorized courts to conduct judicial proceedings remotely through Zoom and other platforms as a way to protect the health and safety of the public, judges, court staff, and so on. Since April of 2020, the State Bar Court has relied on that rule to conduct nearly all of its proceedings using Zoom and telephone. In September of this year, the legislature enacted Senate Bill 241, which, among other things, enacts Code of Civil Procedure 367.75, which is a more permanent rule that will authorize civil proceedings to be conducted remotely for at least about 18 months through July 1st of 2023. And to avoid inconsistencies with that statute, Emergency Rule 3 is set to be amended to exclude civil proceedings on January 1st, 2022. The timing is somewhat kismet in that the Judicial Council will be voting on that item tomorrow morning. And so that's why this item is before you today as a request for interim rules. So what that means for the State Bar Court is essentially that if the changes are approved by the Judicial Council to remove Emergency Rule 3's applicability to civil proceedings, the State Bar Court can no longer rely on that rule to continue to conduct State Bar Court proceedings remotely. So the court would revert essentially to pre-COVID, where unless there's an explicit rule of procedure that authorizes telephonic appearances, or unless the parties stipulate, all proceedings would be conducted in person. So I can give a brief summary of the rules if you'd like, or I'm happy to answer any questions.
Trustees, any questions, requests from Ms. Doherty to summarize the rule? Ms. Doherty, I'm not seeing any takers. Thank you for your presentation. Clearly, this is, this is, I think, a good example of an organization that has done things one way for a long time, being responsive to what's happening in the world. And I appreciate the effort you've put into preparing this item and the work of the State Bar Court during the pandemic. I'll just, put that there. Okay. Seeing no discussion of Mr. Stallings.
Sure, I would move the item.
Motion by Stallings,
This is Arnie. I'll second.
second by Sowell. Seeing no further discussion, may I have the roll call?
Broughton,
Yes.
Chen, Cisneros,
Aye.
De La Cruz, Delenn, Ganong,
Yes.
Petula, Saleg,
Yes.
Shelby,
Aye.
Sol,
Aye.
Stallings,
Yes.
Tony,
Aye.
motion carries.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Okay, folks, that takes care of all of the business on our open session agenda. You will note that there are several chunks to the closed session. It is not yet 3 o'clock. So I think that we have at least one question before us, and that is, do you want to adjourn for the day and just do all the closed session tomorrow, or can we get started in the closed session now? Maybe take an hour and a half, and then finish up closed session tomorrow morning. I'm seeing a bunch of nodding heads. Now, okay, I thought I heard no. Okay, we at that then will convene in a closed session to consider the items that are listed on our closed session agenda. We may not get through all of them this evening or this afternoon, but as required by law, I will announce those that are statutorily authorized. Item 3141 is real estate negotiations, sale, price, and terms of leasing for the property at 180 Howard Street in San Francisco under Government Code Section 11126 sub C7. Under the 5000 series, we have 5001, which is approval of a contract for California bar examiners, first year or the first year law students exam. Under Business and Professions Code 6026.7 sub C. And then we have 3 items under the 7000 series, all of which are being called under the authority of Government Code Section 11126 subsection E1 as listed on the agenda. Madam General Counsel, is that a sufficient announcement? Great. All right, we'll go into closed session. Thank you, everyone.